It took me longer than I want to admit to understand that what happened on my birthday wasn't an isolated moment. It only felt sharp because it was public, because it was undeniable. But once I stopped reacting to that single event and started paying attention to everything around it, the pattern became impossible to ignore. I began to notice how often decisions were made without me, and then presented as if I had simply missed them. Trips, family visits, even small things like dinners out would come up in conversation halfway through, and when I looked confused, someone would casually say, "Oh, we talked about it earlier," as if that explained everything. I would nod. Pretending I remembered, pretending I had been included because correcting them felt like more effort than it was worth. Over time, I realized it wasn't forgetfulness, it was convenience. It was easier for them to move forward without me than to make space for me. There were smaller moments too, the kind that don't sound important when you try to explain them but build into something heavier over time. My sister would borrow things without asking and return them whenever she felt like it. And if I said anything, it would turn into a conversation about how I was being difficult. My mother would ask for my opinion on something, listen just long enough to acknowledge I had spoken, and then turn to someone else for the final decision. My father rarely spoke to me directly, unless it was to point out something I had done wrong or something I should have done differently. None of it was loud. None of it was obvious enough to call out in the moment. But together, it created a quiet understanding that my role in the family was flexible, optional, something that could be adjusted or ignored depending on what was easiest. For everyone else, I tried, for a while, to change it, not in a dramatic way, but in small, careful adjustments. I made an effort to speak earlier in conversations, to offer opinions before being asked, to insert myself into plans before they were finalized. Sometimes it worked. Briefly, I would be included for a moment, acknowledged just enough to feel like things might be shifting, but it never lasted. The attention would drift, the conversation would move, and I would find myself back in the same place, slightly outside of everything, close enough to see but not close enough to matter. It wasn't rejection in the way people usually describe it. No one was pushing me away. They were just not holding on to me. What made it harder was how normal everything looked from the outside. If someone had visited our home, they would have seen a functioning family. There were shared meals, casual conversations, even laughter. Nothing about it would have raised concern, and that made it difficult to trust my own experience because there was no clear moment I could point to and say, "This is where it started," or "This is where it went wrong." It was gradual, almost invisible, and because of that, it felt like something I was supposed to adapt to rather than question. At some point, I stopped expecting consistency. I stopped assuming that I would be included or considered. And instead, I started waiting to see if it would happen. Most of the time, it didn't. And when it didn't, I noticed something else. No one seemed aware that anything was missing. Conversations continued, plans moved forward, routine stayed intact. My absence, whether physical or emotional, didn't disrupt anything. It simply fit into the existing structure, like a piece that had never been essential in the first place. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with a kind of quiet clarity. I wasn't being overlooked by accident. I was part of a system that had learned to function without needing me fully present. And once I saw that, it became harder to keep pretending that all I needed to do was try a little more. The effort I had been putting in wasn't bridging a gap. It was covering it, just enough to make everything appear intact. The moment that changed everything didn't come with raised voices or a clear argument. It happened quietly, in a way that almost felt procedural at first. My father called me into the living room one afternoon, his tone neutral, the same way he spoke when discussing routine matters. My mother was already sitting there, and my sister stood near the doorway, arms folded loosely, watching without saying anything. There was a document on the table, a few pages clipped together, positioned carefully in front of the empty chair they expected me to take. I remember noticing how deliberate it all felt. How prepared they seemed compared to how unaware I was. He explained it in simple terms. There had been a financial decision, something involving property that had been in the family for years. It was being transferred, reorganized in a way that made things easier for everyone moving forward. My sister's name was already included. Mine, he said, would not be necessary. He spoke as if it were a technical detail, not something that required discussion. When I asked a question, just one, about why I hadn't been part of the conversation earlier, he didn't answer directly. He just repeated that it had already been decided. There was a pen placed beside the papers, angled toward me. Not forced, not pushed, just there, waiting. The expectation wasn't spoken out loud, but it was clear I was meant to sign, to acknowledge something I hadn't agreed to step aside in a way that felt official this time. It wasn't like the dinners or the conversations where I could fade into the background without anyone noticing. This was structured, documented. I looked at my mother, hoping for some kind of pause, some hesitation that might slow things down. She didn't avoid my gaze, but she didn't hold it either. She nodded slightly, as if to confirm that everything was in order. My sister shifted her weight, but said nothing. The room stayed, calm, almost too calm, like everything had been arranged to avoid conflict before it could even begin. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't fully allowed myself to see before. This wasn't just about being overlooked or left out of conversations. This was about being removed in a way that would hold up over time, something that wouldn't need to be revisited or explained later. It wasn't emotional in the way I had always expected these realizations to be. It was practical, efficient, and that made it harder to argue against. Because there was no clear point of confrontation, just a quiet expectation that I would comply. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to persuade them to reconsider. For a second, I thought about asking more questions, pushing for details, forcing them to explain what they had already decided without me. But the thought passed quickly, not because I didn't care, but because I could already see how it would end. The same way other moments had ended, with my words acknowledged just enough to move past them. So I sat down, looked at the document, and read it slowly. Not searching for a loophole or a mistake, just taking in what it represented. When I reached the end, I placed the pages back on the table exactly where they had been. The pen remained untouched. I didn't say no, I didn't say yes. I just stood up and stepped away, leaving the decision unresolved in a way they hadn't planned for. No one stopped me as I walked out of the room. No one called after me or asked me to come back. The silence followed me down the hallway, familiar but different this time. It didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like a line, something clear and defined that I hadn't drawn with words, but with action. That was the moment I stopped trying to belong there. Not because I had been pushed out in a dramatic way, but because I had finally seen how easily everything could move forward without me being fully included. And instead of resisting that, I accepted it for what it was. After that day, I stopped asking for explanations that were never going to come in a way that made sense to me. Life at home continued in its usual rhythm. Almost unchanged on the surface, meals were still prepared, conversations still happened, and routines stayed intact. But I was no longer trying to fit myself into them. I began spending more time out of the house, not as a statement, but as a way of creating distance from something I could no longer unsee at first. They noticed only the practical changes. My mother asked once if I was eating elsewhere. My father commented that I was not around much lately, in the same tone he might use for the weather. My sister mentioned it casually during a phone call, like it was just a passing observation. There were no questions that went deeper than surface level. No one asked why. No one tried to understand what had shifted. It was acknowledged, then left alone. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I realized. There was nothing I could say that would change the structure of how they saw things, so I let my silence match theirs. But for a different reason. Not avoidance, but clarity. I stopped filling spaces that no one was waiting for me to fill. What I didn't expect was how quickly things would begin to expose themselves without my involvement. Small cracks appeared first. My sister started missing commitments she had previously taken for granted. My father had to deal with situations I had quietly managed before without recognition. My absence didn't create chaos, but it revealed how much of the balance had relied on unnoticed effort. And without it, things didn't collapse, but they became slightly less smooth, slightly less automatic. I heard pieces of this later, not directly, but through overheard conversations. Frustration masked as casual remarks, confusion about why certain things were taking longer or not being handled the way they used to be. My name came up occasionally, not with anger, but with a kind of reluctant acknowledgement that something had shifted. Still, even then, it wasn't framed as loss. It was framed as adjustment. There was no drama.